In this video, we're going to build an AI chatbot in under 10 minutes using OpenAI GPT-4 model and Vercel AI SDK, which makes it super easy to actually talk to these OpenAI models and stream back a response into our application. We're going to use chatCN components to have this scrollable area for the result of our chat and this inputs. We're going to implement this copy to clipboard functionality so we can just copy the response that comes back from our bot. Simple stuff, but very powerful to implement in an AI chatbot that you can then deploy to any website. So let's dive right in. We're going to build this in NextJs 14 using the app router, TypeScript, Tailwind CSS, and chatCN components. As I mentioned, I've already installed everything. If you wanted to install chatCN, you go to chatCN, and inside the docs, in the installation tab, you can just select Next.js, and all you need to do is copy this init script, which is going to initialize your project by adding a component.json file to it, just as you can see here. And it's going to also install Radix UI, which is the framework that chatCN is built on top of. I've already gone ahead and copied some components as well. So inside the UI folder, I have the avatar, button, input, and scroll area, all of which are coming from chatCN as a starting point. And inside of my app router, I've changed the content of my homepage by including this chat component. So inside of the component, I have this chat component. This is a client component that we're going to build together, where we would implement the functionality of actually calling our API that talks to OpenAI, gets the response back and show it here. So we're going to have a scrollable container for the response and also an input form. So this is all I had done so far. We're going to build from this point on together. I do have a video on the channel where I show how I set up my Next.js projects. I'm going to link it in the card somewhere, and there's a GitHub repo that's a template actually you can copy and clone to start your Next.js applications. So check that out if you want to know how I set up my Next.js applications. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to use the OpenAI APIs or models, specifically this text generation model. We did also talk about this in the previous video, which was where we created an AI blogger, which would create a blog post for us based on a prompt. If you haven't seen that video, I'm going to include that also in the card. But basically, the text generation endpoint is going to give us access to some of the most powerful models in OpenAI, including the GPT-4, which is the newest one at the time of this recording, or the GPT 3.5 Turbo. Now, to use these models, you can use the OpenAI SDK that you can install from this OpenAI package. This is a Node.js package. It's going to give you a client where you can just call different endpoints. For example, here we're going to call the chat completions endpoint. We're going to pass in the model that we wanted to use and some array of messages. This is going to be the back and forth messages that we have from the user to the assistant, which is going to be the AI model. Now, if you have a closer look at these messages here, every message is an object with a role and a content property. The role can be a user. This is the prompt coming from the user. The assistant is the AI response. And then we have the system where you can provide some instructions for your AI assistant in how you want it to respond. For example, here it says you are a helpful assistant. You can say you are a funny assistant, or you are a sarcastic assistant, or give it some instructions about how you want it to respond back or how you want it to answer your questions. We're going to also implement this system instructions inside of our app. We're also going to use the Vercel AI SDK, which is going to make it easier to work with AI models. It's not only for OpenAI. Actually, if you go to the guides under the providers, you can see that there are different adapters that allow you to use the same SDK from Vercel with different models. For example, OpenAI, Hugging Face, AWS Bedrock, so forth and so on. So we're going to use specifically the OpenAI adapter that allows us to stream in the responses that comes back from OpenAI back to our application using a simple hook. So right here, they do have a guide where it actually walks through building a chatbot. So following that is going to exactly help you build a chatbot. We're going to just enhance it a bit more, but we're literally following these steps. So first step, creating a new Next.js app. We have already done so. You have to get your OpenAPI key. In the OpenAPI or OpenAI documentation, you can go to your settings, and here on this side tab, you have the API keys. You have to generate a key. You have some free limits or free tokens you can use, but after some time, you have to subscribe to a paid plan if you want to continue using the models. Now, the first thing that we want to do is to create a route handler. If you're using the app router, just like I am, we're going to create this route that is going to be API /chat. Route handlers in the app router are the equivalent of API endpoints in the pages router if you're coming from the pages router world. So we're going to create this endpoint, and then from inside of our chat client component, we'd be able to submit the prompts to this API endpoint, which is going to talk to OpenAI and get the response back. So let's go ahead and actually create this inside of our app. I'm going to create an API folder. Inside of it, I'm going to put a chat folder, and inside of this, we're going to create a route.ts. Let me copy some code and explain what I'm doing so you don't have to watch me code. So the first thing that we are doing is, after installing the OpenAI, we're getting this OpenAI class that allows us to create an OpenAI client. We're also installing the AI. This is the Vercel AI SDK. So I've already gone ahead and installed them. If you're following along, just go ahead and install these two packages, OpenAI and AI. Now we are running this endpoint or this route handler on the edge. This is just going to make things faster because it runs on the edge network closer to your users. The next step, we are creating an OpenAI client by calling this OpenAI class we got out of the package. We have to pass in our OpenAPI key. You have to set it inside of your local environment variables. I have created this .env.example here. This is a secret key. You should not expose this to your front-end application, and that's why we are including it inside of an environment file. Now, what we're doing here, or what you would typically do inside of your route handlers in the app router, is that you have to export named functions that map to HTTP verbs, such as post here. So we are exposing a post endpoint, and inside of it, we are checking to see if we have this OpenAPI key. If we don't, our OpenAPI or the endpoint or this won't work. So we're going to return a response with a status of 400 to say missing OpenAPI key. And if we do have an OpenAPI key already, we're going to extract the array of messages out of the body of the request that was posted to this endpoint. And we're going to use the OpenAI chat completions endpoint or create endpoint. We are specifying the GPT 3.5 turbo model, and we are passing in the array of messages. This is going to include our system instruction, the user prompt, and also all the previous messages that the assistant responded back. So our model has a context of all the conversation. Now, rather than just sending the prompt, getting the response back, and then refresh and rinse and repeat this process, where we would lose the context of the conversation, we are including this array of messages or all the messages from the start to the end all the time to the API endpoint. So therefore, the AI model has the context of the conversation, and we're going to test this together when we go to the front end. Now, we're going to use this OpenAI stream from the Vercel AI SDK. This is how it makes it actually easier. It turns the response into a stream and streams this back to whoever called this endpoint. Now, obviously, for some simple error handlings, if we encounter any error, we are returning a next response with the error message or saying something went wrong with a status of 500. So that's the first step of creating a route handler. Now, we need a UI that actually has a form that calls this endpoint. Now, in the example here on the right-hand side, you can see we have this chat component. It uses the use client directive because we need to use a hook, this use chat hook from AI React. This is again from Vercel AI SDK. We're going to go to the API references for a second, but before we get there, This has a container that just maps over the messages. This is the array of messages and renders them out, and then has a form input, or a form with an input that takes in the prompt from the user and then calls this handle submit function. Now, all of these functions are returned back from this use chat hook, and that's how the Vercel AI SDK makes it easy to work with this OpenAI model. First of all, it gives you the handle submit. This is going to automatically submit a post request to /API/chat. This is the same route handler that we just created. It also gives you the input. This is the current value of the prompt, an input on change handler. And also it's going to give you the messages. This is the array of messages back. So anytime a user actually submits this form, the prompt is going to be appended to these messages. Then the messages array is going to be sent to the post request to our endpoint. The assistant is going to give us a response and then streams it back to this use chat, which is going to use SWR package under the hood to receive this stream and update our component as these chunks of response are coming back from our API endpoint, and then finally render them here. And that's all we need to create an AI chatbot. Before actually going ahead and wiring our form component up, let's go to the API reference here. As I mentioned, the use chat hook is one of the many helpers that you can get out of these SDK. The use chat is going to take in some options, and it's going to make it easy for you to talk to this text generation AI models. Now, the options that you can pass to it is API. By default, it's calling the API/chat, same as the route handler we just created. You can pass it an ID for this specific chat, initial input, initial messages. We're going to use this to actually give the system instructions as our initial message. It gives you some callbacks on response and on finish and on error. If you wanted to handle or log or handle errors in a custom way, you can use these callbacks. And once you have passed any of these options that you want, is going to give you some helpers back, some state like the messages array, whether or not we had an error, a reload function, a stop function, input, handle input change, and handle submit. These are the functions that we actually use to wire up our form. Okay, so let's go back to our application and start working on this chat component where we can implement this same use chat hook we just saw together. So let me just import this from the SDK, from AI React. So as you can see here, I'm calling use chat without any options. It is giving me an array of messages, an input, handle submit, is loading, and also an error back. So I can use to wire up my form. Let me go ahead and copy some code over here and explain what we're doing. Let's also import these components up top here, and let's refresh our app. Okay, so I have my form down here. I'm using input component from chatCN. I have the input value coming back from this use chat hook and handle input change, some class and CSS styles. I also have the button, which is of type submit, that this is going to submit our form. And I'm looking at the ease loading property that comes back from the use chat to disable this button or form submission if the API is still running, or if you're receiving the response, or if you're loading. And this is an icon from Lucid React that comes out of the box when you're installing chatCN, because this is also part of Radix UI. Okay, so that's the first part of having this form. Now this form automatically is going to submit a post request to our endpoint, which is chat API/chat, and it's going to get a response back. But right now we don't have anywhere to actually show the response or use this array of messages. So let's do this next. I'm going to use the scroll area component from chatCN. If you want to see it, if you scroll down here, the scroll area component is a component that just makes the scrolls universal, whether or not, or regardless of the browser that the user is using. And I find it very nice to implement inside of our application, because as the messages inside of our chat conversation grows, we want to be able to kind of scroll up and down to see the previous messages. Let me just go ahead and import the necessary components. Now I'm using a React ref to control the scroll position of this scroll area component. So let me just go ahead and also bring in a ref up top here so we can pass it down to this scroll area. And to control this scroll, anytime that we have a new message, we're going to use effect. So let me also import this use effect here. Now, anytime that we are having a new message, we want to scroll to the bottom of this scrollable container so we always see the last message. So for that, I'm using the scroll to function on this ref.current, which points to this container. And then I'm setting it to scroll height, which is the height of the current container. Now, one little note here, if you actually go to the scroll area component, now if you look at the code here, the ref that you're passing in using the React forward ref is going to be passed into this root or the primitive root element. But what I actually want to measure or set the scroll position of is this viewport. So I have changed chatbot's component code to pass this ref down to this viewport or the actual container that scrolls for this to work. So if you just install the scroll area component from chatbot and pass a ref to it, this functionality won't work. You have to come in and update this so you're targeting the correct container. Just a little side note, but actually worth mentioning. Now, from a high level, I'm going to explain what we're doing here, but you can also see that we need this copy to clipboard component. We're going to create that in a second together, but let's see what we're doing from a high level here inside of this scroll area. If we have any error message that comes back again from our use chat, if the API throws any error, this is going to be returned back to us. So if I have anything, I'm going to show the message here. Otherwise, I'm getting the messages array. I'm mapping over every object inside of it. If the role is a user, I'm going to use a user avatar and then show the content like so. And if the role is an assistant, this is the response that comes back from AI. I'm showing a different avatar and also the content. And I do have this copy to clipboard, which is going to allow me to copy the AI response or the bot response to wherever I want. And that's all we're doing inside of this scroll area function. And down here we have the form. So let's go ahead and create this copy to clipboard component. So I'm going to go to my components and I'm going to create a new file called copy to clipboard.tsx. But before I write the code for this component, I also want to create a hook. So I'm going to create a folder called hooks. Inside of it, I'm going to have a use clipboard.tsx hook where I would copy this code. And let me show you what I'm doing here. So this is a React hook. I'm using user state and a copy to clipboard functionality that's just using the navigator on the window object to copy whatever text we've passed into this function, and then is going to set is copied to true. And after whatever timeout you pass to it, which is by default 2 seconds, is going to set this back to false, which is going to allow us to show different icons for when we actually click to copy the text. So you're going to see this in action in a second. So let's go back to copy to clipboard and write this component over here. Let me explain what we are doing. So copy to clipboard is using this use clipboard hook, is getting the is copied state and also this function. We're going to hook this up inside of our button with different icons that we have. As you can see, if we are is copied is true, we're going to set a check icon, and if it is not, we're going to just show a copy icon again from Lucid React. And this is a button that's hooked to this onClick event handler. On copy, we are just calling this copy to clipboard, and we are passing in whatever message that's passed to this copy to clipboard component, and we're just copying the content inside of it. Because again, remember, the message is the same message that's returned from our API. It contains a role and a content. Actually, the messages that come back when we are using the use chat hook from Vercel AI SDK also have an ID and a created at time, but we're only interested in the content property. So with that out of the way, if we go back to the chat, the error is gone. We now have our container, and we also have our form that submits this to our API endpoint. So let's go back to our application and refresh our app. Okay, let me go ahead and close all of these components. And now let's test this out. If I say things to learn as a web developer, let's see if we can get a response back. And there you have it. We're having our response back streaming in from our API endpoint, rendered using the use chat that we got out of the Vercel AI SDK into our component. As our component scroll position is updated anytime that we are getting a new message. So we're always seeing the newest message. And right now it's just responding in a long format. Now in the next step, I want to also pass in an instruction to our AI assistant that is going to tailor how it's going to respond back to us. Now going back to this use chat function for a second, as you might already remember, we had this initial messages, which is going to be an array of messages that we can pass in. That is going to be the best place for us to pass that system instruction. So let's go back inside of our chat component, and where I'm calling this use chat, I'm going to pass in an object with this initial messages array, which is just one message inside of it, and it's having an ID, a role of system. And now here I'm saying you are an assistant that gives short answers. Now if I go back to my application and refresh the app, if I put in the same prompt, things to learn as a web developer, this time we should get a shorter answer. As you can see, it's a much shorter answer. So this is where you can pass in any instructions to your AI assistant in terms of how it should behave or any specific format in the response. Now you can also take this from a hard-coded value out and put it inside of another input where you would give your users this ability to actually program the assistant. They can come in and say, hey, you're a funny assistant, you're a sarcastic assistant, you're, I don't know, a second grader teacher. You can just give your users the ability to manipulate how the AI assistant is going to respond to them, or you can just keep it hard-coded as is and put in the instruction that makes sense for your specific use case. Now, one last thing to just show this copy to clipboard button working. If I actually click on it, it turns into that check mark, and then after 2 seconds it turns back into a copy. And if I come down here and paste in, you can see I got the content of the response back copy to clipboard, so I can use it anywhere that I want. So that's a wrap for this video, folks. This is how easy it is to build an AI chatbot using the OpenAI GPT-4 models and Vercel AI SDK that makes it super easy to work with these text generation models and stream the response back in to provide a better user experience. The ways that we can extend this application is to add authentication. Right now, anyone can come to our app and start chatting with our AI. We can add authentication to limit who can use it. And also, speaking of limiting, we can add API rate limiting, so somebody can't just come in and hammer our API endpoint. We're going to do that in a future video, both authentication and rate limiting using Upstash rate limiting package and Vercel KV or key value pair storage option. So stay tuned for that video. If you have any questions for this video, hit me up in the comments. Like always, if you're interested in learning NextJs, I do have a course. There's going to be a link in the description, so check it out. And also, I would really appreciate if you're learning anything from the video to support my work by subscribing to the channel. And that's it for now. Signing out. Bye-bye.